So what exactly is GIS? Well, it's an acronym and it stands for Geographic Information System, or systems. But that's not entirely helpful by itself, so let's expand on that. It's an organized collection of hardware, data, software, and personnel. That's the system part. Designed to effectively capture, store, update, manipulate, analyze, and display data or information related to locations on the Earth's surface. That's the geographic part. So when taken together, it's essentially a combination of different elements that work together to map out spatial data, spatial being the key word there. And much of this spatial data, this geographically referenced information, contains what we call coordinate information, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. So what can it do? What can GIS actually do? You may have heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, this is the tool. This is the field that really captures that phrase. It tells stories. That's what it does, and it does it really well. It does that, and people in the field do that by collecting data, piecing it together, and eventually producing a map, infographic, and maybe some other visualization to help explain a pattern of some type. So how does it do that? How does GIS help to tell these stories? I mentioned coordinates a little bit ago. Now, many of you probably remember learning about your X, Y coordinates when you were younger and still make graphs with those in mind. The Earth is no different. We have an X, or longitude, as our horizontal plane, and Y, or what we call our latitude, for our vertical plane. We use those to map where everything is on the globe. Knowing two objects' coordinates, we can map the distance between the two as a line, and with more points, we can build more complex shapes, which we'll learn about very soon. Now, in the interest of time, we have to speed through this complicated yet really cool subject. The key takeaway, though, is that the Earth is not flat. Believe me, if it was, my job would be a lot easier. Instead, it's closer to a 3D oval shape because it's been spinning for billions of years, and we have to flatten it out to look at it on paper and on our computer screens. And there are different ways for us to flatten out the Earth, or what we call projections. However, it's impossible to flatten the Earth without distorting it somehow. If you've ever tried to flatten a soccer ball, you run into the same thing where something gets stretched or bent or squished. When GIS folks like myself do that to the Earth, it's part of our job to keep track of what is getting distorted and how that affects our map and our analyses in the future. What's important to take away is that you can be sitting right where you are right now, and with different projections, your coordinates on the Earth will be slightly different, or maybe even very different. Our GIS software helps us keep track of this distortion and map out all of this spatial data. Remember that keyword? Now, there are two main directions for GIS software. The first is desktop software, which can do a lot more heavy lifting, but requires extra computing power and is not as easy to share information with. The second is web-based software, which, while not as powerful, still has a lot of applications. Most importantly, it's incredibly easy to share your data and maps with people around the world. And these paths, whether desktop or web-based, can be used to study trends and do really complex analyses. So what kind of data can we use to tell these stories in GIS? Now, there are two main types of data that we use in the GIS world. We call them vector data and raster data. The first type of data we will engage with is called vector data, and is essentially defined as data made with points, lines, and polygons. Now, I mentioned before how coordinate points can be connected to make lines, as well as how when we keep adding and connecting more points, we make more complex shapes. If those lines come back to where they started to make a complete shape, we have a polygon with an area. Let's break it down with an example. Your friend is flying out and you want to take them to the White House. You pull out your phone and open your mapping application. The phone shows up as a blue dot to show where you are, a point. How are you going to get to the White House, though? Will you drive? Will you take the metro? Will you bike? All of these are different examples of lines. We have roads, we have metro lines, we have bike paths. Think about where you will be when you travel there, too. First, you will be in Fairfax County, and then Arlington County, and then Washington, D.C. You will also be crossing over from the state of Virginia to Washington, D.C. These jurisdictions are examples of polygons. Even building footprints are usually polygons, even though your phone just gives you a point to make it easier for you to understand where it is. All of these are examples of vector data. Rasters are another powerful means of keeping spatial data. Think of a picture on your phone or on your computer monitor. Each pixel on the screen has a color assigned to it, and the organization of these pixels display the image in a way you can interpret and understand, rather than a bunch of random static. This is how raster data is formatted. It's broken down into gridded cells to capture data that doesn't really have a boundary, or what we call continuous data. Temperature is a good example of what raster data is used for. Imagine if you went out onto a football field and measured the temperature at every yard. What would the temperature be at the 1 yard line, or the 2nd yard line, or the 10th, or the 50th? Would it be the same? Probably not. It would have ups and downs as you move across the field because the temperature is continuous and hard to capture with a point, line, or polygon. We use raster data for examples like this because it's better equipped to handle it than vector data. And since satellite and aerial photographs are pixelated already, they are suited for whatever raster data can be used for. Now, we've already covered some GIS terminology. For example, I talked about raster and vector data, projections, and coordinates. But there's a few other words I want to share with you because it really gets at something pivotal about GIS and what makes it so powerful. Remember my example about traveling to the White House? I mentioned roads, bike paths, the boundary between Washington, D.C. and Virginia, and drone coordinates. Also remember I mentioned satellite images and aerial photographs. Each of these are what we call data layers, but why do we use the word layer? Because we stack them on top of each other to display data. If you're familiar with Adobe Photoshop or Microsoft PowerPoint, then you may be familiar with layering things so that they display first versus being in the back. When we work with spatial data in GIS software, we think of it much in the same way, where layers on top are seen over layers that are beneath them. One thing to note, though, is that each layer can hold only one type of data. I can't have two pictures on one sheet of paper and see both clearly, right? The next word that's important to share with you is what we call features. All the individual points, lines, and polygons we have in our vector data layer is a feature in and of itself. If you had a spreadsheet, this is the row in the spreadsheet. Each street, each address, each park, each building are all examples of rows in our spreadsheet. They are all features. Compare that to attribute. Attributes are the facts associated with each feature. They're the columns in our spreadsheet. If you're sitting in a building, that building has a street number that combines the street name and street type. It's also in a city as well as a state and a zip code, which together form one complete address. Even more, it was built in a specific year and maybe one story or a dozen. All of these are different details that might have to do with that one particular feature. They're all attributes. When we put these together, we get what's called an attribute table. That's our vocabulary word for spreadsheet, where rows are called features and columns are called attributes. But why are we talking about tables when we're mapping people? Well, it's because an attribute table is connected to our vector data sets. So if I were to click on a particular park in our parks layer, I would see this table showing me all the attributes having to do with that park feature, like the name, what supervisor district it's in, the type of park that it is, and estimated acreage. This is really the connection between the words spatial and data. The attribute table is the data, and the spatial aspect is how it's connected to a map. So why GIS? Why tell these stories in the first place? Well, it's to answer questions and make better decisions. Having more information at hand allows you to answer deeper questions and make more confident choices. And let me tell you, there are so many uses for GIS. It is absolutely mind-blowing. Just consider how many questions involve where. Where is there traffic on the way to school or work? Where is crime happening? Where is the nearest hospital? Where are rivers facing the most pollution? Where should we put resources for the incoming natural disasters? Where should I locate my next business? GIS helps to answer all of these questions and more. There are 1,000 applications at least, and we only have so much time to discuss them with you. And we're really lucky. Fairfax County has one of the strongest GIS communities out there. We have so many different agencies with their own dedicated GIS personnel. And those that don't have their own personnel, it is the job of the GIS division to help them out and make sure they get the most up-to-date and advanced analysis to make the most informed decisions, and ultimately to serve you, the public. Now I'd like to end by sharing 2 examples of GIS to highlight just how powerful it was and how powerful it's become. This first example is one of the first uses of spatial analysis to tell a story. The year is 1854 in the Soho neighborhood of London, the United Kingdom, and there was a massive cholera outbreak. Now, these were not uncommon at the time because germ theory hadn't been solidified yet, and wouldn't for another decade or so. Some people had hypothesized, yes, but it had not gained enough traction yet for people to become truly receptive to the idea. Instead, we operated under something called the miasma theory, literally translating from ancient Greek to mean polluted air. So a physician by the name of John Snow hypothesized something that, at the time, was considered rather unorthodox. He thought that water might be the cause for the spread of cholera, much in the same way that bad air can spread sickness. Essentially, if bad air can exist, well, why not bad water? Snow mapped out where all the deaths from this outbreak took place, along with a Reverend Henry Whitehead, who was a staunch believer in the miasma theory and was actually looking to prove Snow wrong. That's what all the black lines on the map to the right are. They're tallies of deaths at each address from this outbreak. And when you look at where the public water pumps are overlaid on this map, we can better understand why Snow had the hypothesis that he had. So the 2 of them, scientist and priest, actually found the same information from inverse audiences. Snow found from interviews with victims' families that the victims had all drank from one single pump, the Broad Street pump. Whitehead found that those who had never been sick never touched that pump, though. Taking his findings to the local governing council, they were given permission to remove the handle on the pump the very next day, making it completely unusable. Soon after, the sickness passed entirely. While the epidemic may have been passing on its own, this certainly was the deciding factor to end it. This study, which eventually was published, helped to earn Snow the label Father of Epidemiology, epidemiology being the study of disease. Yet he may not have done it without some simple spatial analysis, too. Even if he had the right assumption, he may very well not have convinced the governing council without this simple map. And the great thing about this case study, the truly awesome thing, is however you break it down, whether just glancing at the distribution, using sophisticated GIS software, or in-depth spatial analysis methods, the answer always points to the Broad Street pump. Let's look at GIS today. The COVID-19 dashboard by the Johns Hopkins University Center for System Science and Engineering is a prime example of what GIS stands for today. You may very well have seen it or heard about it before. It is somewhat of a coincidence that perhaps one of the most popular uses of GIS today is also an example of epidemiology in action. Or is it? Public health is one of the most important things to look after and is perhaps one of the strongest uses of GIS. A dashboard is just a type of product that displays information like the example on the screen. It has statistics, a map, and charts that are all connected to show different sides of the same data. This one has kept track of COVID cases, deaths, and eventually vaccination distribution in real time for the past 3 years from authoritative sources around the globe, 260 sources to be exact. By March 2020, just 6 weeks after it was shared publicly, it had received 1 billion visits. Since then, it's been seen in presidential addresses and still shows up in news articles today, and it's been visited more than 1.6 trillion times, making it the most popular example of GIS today by far. Just think of that for a minute. There is this one site where any one of you can type in a link and go see an immense wealth of statistical data for the entire world for this one disease that is updated on an hourly basis. Compare the John Snow example, who acted with one other person and collected some data on paper and made an extremely positive impact. Now we have hundreds of authoritative sources providing timely data to one source that is readily accessible by anyone with an internet connection. This is the power of GIS and how far it's come. Even still, it continues to grow. I hope you've enjoyed learning some of the basic building blocks that lead to this level of cooperation. If you're interested in seeing what more Fairfax County has to offer in the world of GIS, we encourage you to check out our homepage at fairfaxcounty.gov/maps. Through here, you can access our static map gallery where, with just a few mouse clicks, you can download wall-size maps of various themes like parks, congressional boundaries, and fire and rescue assignments. Or maybe you'd like to look at our interactive map gallery to view over 100 different web-based applications that let you view our Fairfax County properties, infrastructure, historical imagery, and much more. Or maybe you want to download that county data yourself to use in your own geospatial tasks. Well, head on over to our Open Geospatial Data portal to explore more than 100 different data layers and tables that we make available to the public. We make all this available to empower yourselves for your mapping needs. But if you ever have any questions, you can always reach out to us at our homepage at fairfaxcounty.gov/maps or by phone at 703-324-2712. Take care.